crypto. Mrs. Kennedy decided on the major points of what was going to happen, and she wanted to follow protocol, and she wanted to follow history as it had occurred in Abraham Lincoln's funeral.
The next day, many members of the administration were invited to the White House. President Kennedy lay in state in the East Room, and my memory isn't so much of the coffin on the catafalque as it is of Robert Kennedy, who was in the receiving line with two of his sisters when I came. I don't think I'd ever seen human pain that was so intense expressed in someone's face that way. It was though he himself had been mortally wounded. And of course he had been in part by the president's death because they were so close. And the grief and the torment of that never left Robert Kennedy throughout his life. I can remember in subsequent times, for example, months later, it was not unusual, having worked late at the Justice Department, for Bobby to say, let's go to the cemetery. And we would go to Arlington and climb across a wall and walk that long distance to the grave, and the sentry there knew Robert Kennedy, and Bobby would kneel and pray. It was just something that was with him constantly.
Kennedy's loss was not just the loss of a president, but it was the loss of a friend, particularly to blacks. And he was the man who got my attention politically. It was because of him I registered to vote and to participate in a presidential campaign in 1960. So all of that was going through my mind. And as I stood at the White House on that Saturday, as dignitaries came from Earl Warren, who wrote the unanimous decision in the Brown versus the Board of Education, which sort of outlawed segregation and opened things up. And I watched as the fellow who was with him, George Wallace, here were two extremes, two men from opposite ends of the political spectrum visiting, paying their last respects to John Kennedy. It had a kind of choking emotion with me, and you wonder what would happen now.
I remember one moment I walked outside and went down in the alleyway along the West Wing. And as I was standing there, they were bringing Kennedy's chair, his rocking chair, out. This was Saturday morning. It was the rain. And a few minutes later, they came from the EOB with a saddle on a mount, which obviously belonged to Lyndon Johnson. Well, power changes very quickly and very brutally in Washington. And I'll never forget the exchange of those two pieces of furniture within a 20-minute period, and life goes on.
Throughout Saturday night, workers prepared the Capitol, where the president would lie in state.
chiefs of state. Nobody stood on ceremony. Nobody cared who went before or after. The ranks, the privileges, every head of state who came and every head of delegation wanted to, of course, interact with Mrs. Kennedy and to express their homage and their salute to our fallen leader. I must tell you one poignant story. When we had gone in a happy time, a wonderful time, to Buckingham Palace, she asked my advice as to whether or not she should curtsy to the Queen. And I said, well, now, chiefs of state and wives of chiefs of state do not go around curtsying to one another. No. So, on the day of the funeral, when Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, comes to her, she did drop a little curtsy to him, and she turned to me and she said, Angie, I'm no longer the wife of a chief of state. I promise you, I nearly broke down.
All through that weekend, I think, like the nation, Washington was stunned and almost beyond grief, and those who had close personal feelings for President Kennedy, or anyway identified with his government, congregated in small groups in Washington. And I remember with this group talking in the words of Walt Whitman's poem, My Captain, coming back to my mind. My captain does not answer, his lips are pale and still. My captain does not hear my voice, he has no pulse or will. Exalt, O shore, ring out, O bells, but I with mournful tread will walk the deck, my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. Although the Lincoln obsequies had taken place almost a century before, there were so many echoes of that terrible sadness that the country must have felt when Abraham Lincoln fell, in terms of the mortal wounding of John Kennedy. To add to the trauma of that incredible series of days, there suddenly was the murder of Lee Harvey Oswald that took place in front of us. Jack Ruby murdering him. I mean, it was a scene without parallel, certainly, in the history of American television and probably in American history.
They were taking the casket to lie in state at the Capitol, and I thought it was interesting that we started walking down the driveway of the White House behind it, and I don't think any of us, a big bunch of reporters, people, I don't think any of us had any idea of walking all the way. We just kept on walking. We just followed it, walked all the way to the Capitol, which is quite some distance.
All I could do was do the work in front of me and not to think about how I personally